haunted ride operator. Jack Henderson had been working the carnival circuit for over a decade, operating rides, cleaning up after hours, and packing up whenever the show moved to a new town. He was a quiet, unassuming man who preferred the simplicity of his life, no long-term commitments, no real home, just the road and the carnival. But in all his years, nothing had ever unnerved him like the haunted house ride at Lakeview Carnival. It was a ramshackle old ride, one of the oldest attractions still operating. The structure had been moved from town to town for so many years that it had gathered layers of dust, grime, and a history of ghostly legends. The Screaming Shadows was what the sign above the entrance read, in cracked, faded letters. The ride was your typical haunted house attraction: fake cobwebs, mannequins dressed as monsters, and flickering lights designed to startle unsuspecting customers. But the ride had a reputation. Kids who rode it alone claimed they saw figures lurking in the corners, far beyond the reach of the ride's weak strobe lights. Others swore they heard voices, not the corny sound effects designed to scare, but soft, whispering voices that called out their names. Some even said the shadows on the walls didn't move like they should, darting out of sync with the lights. And then there were the people who left the ride visibly shaken, swearing they had seen faces in the dark, watching them from the walls. At first, Jack didn't pay much attention to the stories. It was just another haunted ride after all. His job was simple: press a button, send the riders on their way, and keep an eye on the controls. But over the past few weeks, the complaints had started piling up. More and more patrons seemed disturbed when they got off the ride. Kids were crying, adults looked pale, and once, a teenager had stormed out, demanding a refund because the ride had grabbed him. Jack shrugged it off as theatrics at first, but then the reports started to get stranger. People said they had seen other riders in the carts with them, figures that disappeared by the time the ride ended. Some swore they saw extra doors open along the track, leading to dark hallways not part of the ride's original layout. And the whispers, they were becoming more frequent. Riders said they could hear voices calling their names, sometimes even mimicking the voices of loved ones. The unsettling part came when Jack started hearing those same whispers, even when the ride was empty. One night, after the carnival had closed and the workers were winding down, Jack decided to investigate. It wasn't unusual for him to stay late, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, the kind that seemed to hum with anticipation. Jack grabbed a flashlight and made his way over to the haunted house ride. The lights inside were off, but the track still hummed quietly, waiting for the next day's riders. Jack walked along the path the carts followed, his flashlight sweeping over the fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons that had been there for years. As he passed the dark, dusty corners, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The further he ventured into the ride, the more the air seemed to chill. Then he heard a soft, distant sound like a giggle. Jack froze. It wasn't the recorded laugh that usually played as part of the ride. This was something different, more intimate, like a child laughing just behind him. He spun around, shining his light into the shadows, but there was nothing there. He pressed on, determined to find the source of the sounds. As he neared the middle of the ride, where the track twisted and turned sharply, something strange caught his eye. A section of the wall, barely noticeable in the dim light, seemed to be slightly ajar. It wasn't part of the ride's layout, at least not one Jack had ever seen before. He approached it cautiously and pushed it open. The door creaked, revealing a narrow passageway that extended into the darkness beyond the ride's boundaries. Jack's heart raced. He had been working this ride for months and had never known this passage existed. He stepped through the doorway, his flashlight cutting through the pitch black. The air inside the passage was colder than outside, and the walls were rough and unfinished, as if they hadn't been touched in years. Jack moved slowly, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the tight space. The further he went, the more he could hear faint whispers, just out of reach, like they were bouncing off the walls. Jack. He stopped dead in his tracks. The whisper had said his name. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the passage with his light, but there was no one there. The only sound was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, he saw something that made his blood run cold: scratches along the walls. Deep, uneven gouges carved into the stone, as though something had tried desperately to escape. Along with the scratches were faded stains, dark and rusty, smeared across the surface. He forced himself to move forward. The passage twisted and turned in impossible ways, deeper into the bowels of the ride. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a hidden chamber. Jack's flashlight flickered for a moment before stabilizing, illuminating the room in a weak beam. It was a forgotten part of the ride, clearly never meant to be seen by patrons or workers. The room was filled with old, broken carnival equipment, half-constructed mannequins, abandoned props, and a tangle of wires. But that wasn't what caught Jack's attention. In the center of the room stood a large, old-fashioned mirror. It was cracked and dirty, but its surface still reflected the pale glow of Jack's flashlight. He stepped closer, feeling a sense of dread well up inside him. Something about the mirror felt wrong. As he gazed into it, he saw his own reflection staring back, but something was off. His reflection's eyes were too wide, too wild, and its smile was twisted in a grotesque grin. Jack stumbled back, but the reflection stayed, grinning at him. Then, slowly, the reflection's hand reached out from the glass. Jack screamed and dropped his flashlight, the beam rolling across the floor, casting eerie shadows across the room. He backed away, but the mirror's surface rippled, and a figure began to emerge from it, a twisted, malformed version of himself, its face contorted into a mask of pain and rage. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all saying his name. Jack grabbed his flashlight and bolted, racing back through the narrow passageway, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadows along the walls seemed to reach out for him, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke. Finally, he burst through the door and back into the ride. The air outside the passage was stale but nowhere near as suffocating as it had been in the hidden tunnels. Jack collapsed against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The ride was silent once again, save for the distant hum of the power still running through the track. He didn't sleep that night. The mirror, the voices, the shadows, they haunted his every thought. But what bothered him most was what he had seen just before he left the hidden room. On the wall next to the mirror, scrawled in dark, jagged letters, was a message. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." Jack knew he had to quit. There was no way he could continue working at the carnival after what he had seen. But when morning came and the sun rose, he found himself back at the control panel of the haunted ride, unable to explain why he hadn't left. As the first patrons of the day lined up for the screaming shadows, Jack noticed something strange. The shadows in the ride, the ones that moved on their own, he could see them now. Even in the daylight, they weren't just tricks of the light. They were real, and they were watching him. And then, in the reflection of the ride's glass control panel, Jack saw his own reflection grinning back at him, but his face wasn't his own anymore. It was twisted, distorted, and hollow, just like the figures in the hidden passage. The carnival ride wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It had claimed him, too. Jack was no longer the ride operator. He was part of the ride, part of the shadows, waiting to claim the next victim.